Okay, I've gone ahead and taken our point light for our main explosion, and I've cloned it using Control C on the keyboard, and I've made a total of 8 from cloning it, and I've gone ahead and placed those in all the spaces where there are major explosions. And as you can see, we have them placed right where each one of the pieces, the major sets of pieces, are going to be coming out. And I've gone ahead and edited the envelopes that we created before, and I'll pull that up and show that to you. Just grab one of the random lights, let's say this one down here, and make sure that light's selected, hit P on the keyboard for the properties, and then what we can do is select volumetric light options, and then luminosity is the envelope that we have. And I'm going to shrink this down a little so you can kind of see a little more what's going on, and I'll just close out these other windows. And since that's pretty much one of the first explosions, we don't have the set to 0 starting out. It's set at 100 because we have shadows enabled, so therefore you won't see that light up until the point where it's no longer hidden by an object. And it'll be shining out up until about frame 60, and it'll fade out between 50 and 60. And I've just gone ahead and edited all the other lights to fade out at their correct points. Maybe we'll grab another light with a different type of envelope, and I can show you that. This one's a little bit different. This one's towards the end, so therefore we don't even have it fading out all the way, just because we don't need to. And at 150, that comes in, this light right down here, and that will increase as that it's exploding, and then carry out pretty much throughout the rest of the animation. There's another thing I wanted to make a note of, and the fact is, this animation is rather long, and it is going to be pretty much slow motion for the explosion, and I think everything looks better in slow motion as opposed to having it at regular speed, because then it's a little too quick. Plus, with slow motion, if we render it in slow motion, then we don't have to worry about later if we want to increase the speed. We can without any loss of quality, and if we were to create it in regular motion, render it regularly, and then go off and try to slow that down later, it'll be a lot more difficult because there will be frames that we won't have there. As you can see, we're getting this flashing in here, but that's just kind of an artifact from having the envelopes, and of course it's not going to look like that throughout the animation. I've also gone ahead and taken each one of those point lights, and I've taken their light intensity and changed it to 15 for all of the clones. And our main light is still set to 100, and the color of white is fine. We don't need to change that color at all, because that's going to affect our volumetric lighting, which we already have set to how we need it. And I've made another change to the Hypervoxels. So if we just pull up that using Control F6, and then you can double click on Hypervoxels, I've taken our dissolve level on each one of the pieces and increased it to 80. So only 20% of that hypervoxel is showing, and that's just because we have so much in the scene that when they're overlaying each other, if we were to render it right now, or before this dissolve up to I believe we had set to about 65 before, you'd notice that everything was very yellow and all kind of blending together the same color. And I've increased it a little bit more for the section 3 pieces. I've increased those to all 90. And the reason for that is all those section 3 pieces are right here, as you can see on the left side of the screen, and all those particles are overlapping each other, and we'll be able to see a lot more definition now just by increasing that dissolve so it won't blend together so much. If I open up the Viper, I've made a render preview of the whole scene of just the hypervoxels, and of course we can't see the pieces, each individual, but we can take a look at the actual hypervoxels and see right now, before we had that test render, if you looked, if you can go back in the video and take a look at that, we had that test render where everything was all yellow through here, and we went ahead by changing the dissolve level, increasing it. Now we have a much more consistent value, or less consistent, and it's not so yellow, and there's a little more definition in there. And I'll just play that out. And we just have our pieces coming out here, and everything all going together. And all of our lights that we created are cloned, are all have the same volumetric options. Like I said before, we didn't really make any changes, because these are the shadowed volumetrics. And I've also added another explosion. Most of the explosions are going to be in the central part of the planet, but I've added one right here. I can grab that light, and if you take a look, now if you notice there's a little bit of premature movement and it's not really matched up, but it doesn't light up until the point about right here, so we don't really need to worry about the animation before that. And all that's going to do is, if we take a look at the camera, is once those pieces start to break apart, it's going to send out our light rays shooting out of that and kind of follow it out throughout here. Of course, it's pretty much faded out by this point once it reaches off screen. And I've also gone ahead and changed the intensity of that light. So if we go to our volumetric light options and we take a look at the luminosity level, I have that luminosity set a lot lower than the other ones, because all the other ones we have set about 150, but since this is going to be a smaller explosion, I've changed it to not go over 130. And if we follow the graph, as we're scrolling along here, I'll set this to the camera view, and we can go ahead and make this smaller again. And maybe we'll put it down here. And just take a look at this explosion. And right as it starts exploding, our light will fade in and then fade out just before it goes off screen. Okay, the next thing we want to start working on is adding our debris. And we're going to be using particle generators for that. And the debris, we're actually going to be using Hypervoxels objects, just because then we can use the size variation tool, and we don't need to worry about having a whole lot of extra geometry using the effects linker, which you could do if you wanted to have very specific objects, but it would tie up the scene, and your computer's processor would be kind of heavily overloaded with thousands and thousands of tiny debris objects that are several hundred polygons each. Okay, so now we're going to add our first emitter, and what we can actually do is, since we have these lights placed, we can use those as the parent objects for each one of our emitters of the explosions. And go ahead and we'll start out by going items, dynamic object, and particle, and HV emitter, and we're just going to call this debris 001. Of course, we'll mostly be cloning these, and then hit OK. And we'll just close out that options right now, and I'm going to hit M on the keyboard for our motion options, and I want to parent it to the light, so I want to parent it to light 1, and we'll take a look here, and that's going to be our first explosion that we have, I believe. Okay. And it doesn't have to remain exactly where that light is. We could pull it out a little bit more, and we probably should, just so there's not so many particles shooting out of the actual planet itself. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to parent it to a different light right now. And select this one down here, which is 3, copy 3. We'll go back and select that object, and we're going to set that to 3. So we can go down here right now and just work with this one at first. I'm going to pull up the object properties, so Shift O and then P on the keyboard. Select Dynamics and double click on FX Emitter. And now what we want to do is set our start frame. So we'll change this to perspective view just so we can get a closer look at exactly where this explosion is and where we should start out. And we're going to want them to explode about right here. So, because we don't want them jetting out entirely out of the objects, although it will be on fire and it won't be noticeable too much, so we can pull it in a little bit more. And we'll start this explosion at what looks like should be 40. So we'll set the fixed under generator, and we'll start it at 40. And under particle, we want to change our lifetime to 210 frames, just so we make sure we get throughout the whole life of the object. And now we want to set the emitter size. So generator, or the generator size. And just because we're not going to have it exploding from a real tiny point, and we're not going to have it from a extremely large point, but we want to basically have it emitting from the size of the explosion. So what we have right now, we might want to make it just a little bit bigger than it is, and we're just going to have all those particles shooting out pretty much all in less than a second. And look about right here, and I think I'm going to make that generator size 1.5 meters and just make it a little bit bigger, just so it's not all shooting out from such a centered area. Okay. And we're going to move to motion, and we're going to set our explosion to 5 and just see how that looks. Notice everything's kind of coming out there, but we also have a little bit of resistance, so we want to change our particle resistance to 0. And if you notice, we have our birth rate set to 100, so they're all slowly coming out during this scene, and we want them all to come out at once, because if it was an explosion, it wouldn't be continuously shooting out debris. It would be a one single spout of debris. So we're going to generate by frame, and that'll make everything shoot out at once. And if we set our birth rate, we'll just set it up to 1,000. And we'll change this back to our camera view and take a look. And as you can see, we have a very round explosion of particles coming out of there. And that should be okay. And we don't really need to worry about interaction or gravity, of course, because we're in space, and the only gravity that would be created was from this planet that we're blowing up. And we might want to reduce the amount of particles just a little, maybe to 900, and we'll set our particle limit to 900, just because we don't have too much in there, because we will have more explosions coming out from over here. Alright, and now we're going to enable hypervoxels on these particles. So, Control and F6, double click on hypervoxels. And for this we can also use a preset. We're going to double click on debris. We'll open up our Viper window we have here, make it a little bit bigger. And right now I have this set to scene preview, which is going to show every hypervoxel in the entire scene and not just the specific object we're working on. We'll set that to object right now. Make sure we're in draft mode so it shows up a lot quicker. We're going to pull up our preset panel by hitting F8, or sorry, yeah, F8 on the keyboard. And then we're going to select rock. And what we want to do is just add a rock that's going to kind of match the planet. And of course these are it's really large right now. We can close out the presets, and we're going to select geometry and try changing the particle size and just make it nice and small. So it's not so small that you can't see it, but enough that you can tell it's kind of rocky. And it doesn't necessarily have to look entirely like rock from this far away. But if anything was to come near the camera, you would obviously see that it is rocky, and that way we don't just have to use standard particles. And it just adds a little bit more to it, and it looks a little bit better. Size variation, so we're going to change our particle size right here to 50 millimeters, it looks best. And we want to change our size variation so that we don't have the same size rocks shooting out entirely from the object. And we can change that up to, actually, if we want, depending on how big of chunks we want shooting out, we can change it up to 500. And then we have these real large chunks in here and real small ones, but we don't want them too big. So I'm going to change that down, and maybe we'll do 250. And that way they're not too large, but they're not too small, and we have enough variation in there. And we'll change this back to scene preview and kind of take a look, see how it looks with the fire in the background. And as you can see, a lot of our particles are being consumed by the fire, but that's okay. It'll give it a lot more depth, it'll look a lot more realistic that way, and that's also going to cover up the fact that we have particles shooting out of the rocks. And if you look right here, they're actually coming out of the rocks, or the pieces that we have broken off. And if they weren't on fire, you'd be able to see that a lot more, and you might want to change that. And if you wanted to, you could make this a collision object. But if we were to do that, then we'd have to make every single piece a collision object, and that could take a lot of extra computing time. And plus, if we're not really going to see it anyway, we don't really need to worry about it too much. So now we have a debris set up. We can go ahead and start cloning that and pasting it and then parenting it to all our other lights. And then we can also position it. And then we're going to go ahead and start changing the fixed frame on that so they start at different times, so we don't have the same thing over and over or all at once. So we'll select that, make sure we have the debris selected, and Control C for a clone. And we'll do one clone right now, because I'm just going to clone one at a time, just as we need them. Make sure we have it selected. Make sure we have our slider set down to frame 0. And make sure we have move, so modify move selected. And I want to parent this, or have the parent for this be this light right here. And I'm not sure which one it is, so I'm just going to click on it, and that's 8. So it's clone number 8, so we're going to select that debris object, hit M on the keyboard for motion options. Its parent item is going to be 8. And actually, since I moved it, it's not going to match up entirely, so we have to just hit reset, and that'll move it back into place. And that's just because when it's parented, it takes the parent's motion and its coordinates. And now if you take a look here, we have this exploding a lot earlier than it's supposed to, so we'll open up our object properties, making sure we have objects, and then hit P on the keyboard. Or you can click down here, make sure we're in the Dynamics tab, double click, the effects emitter, and for fixed, we're going to change this to, it looks like the explosion starts at 85, so let's change that to 85. And then we'll go ahead into the Hypervoxels. And actually, we still have that on there. And when you clone the item, it also clones its Hypervoxels properties. So we don't need to worry about cloning or copying and pasting that over. And I'm going to pull up our Viper and take a look with the new debris in there. And as you can see, we have this nice dissolved areas uh, with our debris at different depths all over throughout. And it's really starting to look like a real explosion. And adding the debris can be a real nice touch to creating lots of little fragments flying everywhere. And using hypervoxels, like I said, is a really great way because the only computing time you have to worry about is the rendering for the hypervoxels, and since we're already rendering pretty much a full scene of hypervoxels, adding little bits here and there won't really add too much to the rendering. Alright, so I'm going to go through now and assign each one of these to a light and make some clones. Okay, and I haven't finished cloning all these items yet and assigning them all, but I wanted to make sure I showed you this. We're working on the sort of the first explosion that we have, and if you take a look, I'm going to show you what we have for the particle options, and we're going to just do our start frame at 40, but as you notice, we have them all shooting out from one side, and that's so that we're not penetrating the object of the planet before all the fire is around it, and that way this is more realistic too. And we do have it going through this object right here, but at that point it'll be consumed in fire and you won't really be able to tell that that's happening. And I want to show you how I did that. And in the object properties under dynamics, under motion, I put a -3 on the velocity and on the x and on the z. And what that's doing is, if you take a look, is it's directing it in that, or putting it in that direction, shooting it off sideways or diagonal. So we did 3 this direction and 3 this direction, so it's balancing out in the center of the diagonal. And we have everything shooting out. And now we don't have to worry about going through the planet before the rest of this is all exploded. And now I'm going to go ahead and finish cloning and placing the rest of these debris objects. Alright, we've added all the debris objects now, and I've rendered a quick Viper view of scene preview showing all the debris we have in here along with all the fire and the fire hypervoxels. As you can see, we have lots of debris in here now. It makes the scene look a lot more real, a lot more interesting. And if we take a look at the actual scene now, and all the different particles we've created a couple thousand, 1,000 per explosion about. And for some of them, we actually increased the amount of particles we had up to 1,100 on some of them, depending on the size of the explosion. And from far away, you can see it's a very circular looking pattern, but since we're up close, you can't really tell that too much. We've also changed the velocity, like we did on that first one I just showed you, to match up with certain areas. As you can see, I'll show you just all the different ones on the sides over here. You can see how this one down here shoots off to the side a little. If we change the perspective, maybe this one, you can see it's all shooting out of the side, and it's not really coming out the top at all. And like I said, if we look at the Viper, just that full scene together, you can just see all those different rocks in there, and it's going to look really neat once it's all rendered and put together. And there's another thing we want to add before we're finished, or before we start moving on to the other lighting for the explosions, the volumetric lighting that's not going to have ray trace shadows. And what we want to do is create more particles. And these particles are going to be sort of our sparks. And we're going to be using partigons for that. So we're going to items and dynamic object particle, and this time partigon emitter, and we're just going to call this sparks. And then hit OK. And we can close out that panel for right now. And what we can do for these sparks objects is just go ahead and parent these to our debris objects we just created. But we'll go ahead and set these up first. Or I'll hit M on the keyboard, and actually I'm going to parent that to light 1, and that's sort of our first explosion. And we kind of want these particles to pretty much match up with the other ones, so we're pretty much doing the same thing. And we could just clone the existing particles that we are using for the hypervoxels, but the only problem with that is then the particles are going to match up exactly, and they'll be inside of the hypervoxels and they won't show up at all. So we want to do a little bit different. We will add a little bit of vibration to these and whatnot, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So open up the Objects panel, and under Dynamics, we want to do the same thing we did before, and we're going to have our start frame, looks like for this one, at about, oh, I'd say 45. We'll try it at 45, see how it looks. And we're going to go ahead and change this to generate by frame. Our particle limit 1000 is fine. And our birth rate we're going to set to 500. And we'll take a look, because we don't have any explosion set right now, so we'll go to motion. Actually, we'll go to particle first, and we'll turn off resistance, because we don't want it holding back at all. And we'll go ahead and change our time frame to 210 frames. Under motion now, we're going to change our explosion to 5. And as you can see, we might want to make that start out a little bit earlier. That fixed frame will start at 35 and see how that looks. And maybe even earlier than that. We might as well just start it at 30 when the actual animation starts for that explosion. And we're going to want to change our velocity. So we're going to do a -3 on the X and a -3 on that Z. And now we have our particles shooting out very quickly. And so what we can do is, because when you're using velocity, you're going to want to tone down your explosion rate, just because velocity is going to not only direct exactly where the particles are going in their direction, but it's also going to increase the speed of the particles going into that direction. And it's sort of pulling them towards that direction, so they will go faster when you turn up the velocity. But it's a lot easier than adding a wind object. So I'm going to just change down the explosion to 3. And as you can see, it's all kind of shooting out of that object right there, and we want to spread it out a little bit more. So maybe we'll change it to 3.5. And we'll go back to actually our velocity, and maybe we'll do a -2. And that way it's still going in the direction, but it's not so confined to that center area. And that looks like it should be good right there. We're going to leave target alone, and our vibration right here, we're going to turn that up to 3 and see how that looks. And that'll just spread it out a lot more. Okay, that should be good for that object. And like I said, these are just going to be sparks. And what we're going to do for the sparks is go up to our surface editor, and now if you notice, under sparks we have Partigon. And the Partigon is the surface for these particles right here. And we're just going to do a real quick and easy surface for that. Just up our luminosity to 100%. We're going to change our color to an orangish color. And we're leaving our diffuse at 100 too, so we get that nice variation glow, and that'll show up throughout the whole object. And now we're also going to add a texture map for color, and we're going to change it to procedural, and we're going to make it almost a black but a very dark orange. And we'll change the size, and since each square on the grid is 1 meter, we'll take a look at that. We'll probably make this 500 millimeters, so 0.5 all the way down. And we're going to up our contrast to 50%, our small power 0.75, see a little more variation in there, and frequencies we'll do 5. And you won't be able to see each individual particle looking like this, but what you'll see is that spread out throughout the whole set of particles, and you'll get a nice variation so they're not all the same brightness, and it'll really make a big difference. Under advanced, we're going to want to add a glow intensity to this, and we're going to up that just to 100% because it's the only thing that's really going to be glowing in the scene. Actually, we might even crank that down just a little. Actually, yeah, we'll do 50% for that. And it is the only thing in the scene that's going to be glowing, but it might affect our lights a little if we have glow on. And I'm going to go ahead now and also just clone that as we did before to match up with now our debris objects and have them facing and exploding in the right directions. But before I do that, I'm going to show you how glow works. And if you hit Control F8, it's going to bring up our processing under effects. And we're just going to enable glow. And this only affects the post-render. So once everything's rendered, it's going to apply a filter pretty much, which is going to make each one of these little particles glow, or any surface that has glow intensity on it. We'll up our intensity to 75%, and as far as the glow radius goes, it really depends on the size of the image that you're rendering, and because it goes by pixels and not by a percentage. So it's just very linear, and it's not a non-linear setting. So if we were doing a test render, which is very small, let's say 200 by 100, and we have it set to 8 pixels, they might appear very, very large particles, but if we increase the render size to, let's say, 1600 by 1200 or something very large, then 8 pixels is not going to seem like a whole lot for that glow radius. So really what you want to do is do a full render of the whole scene just to kind of check and see how large you want it. I usually like a larger number, somewhere around 20. Maybe we'll up or decrease our intensity to 65, and that should give us a nice glow on those particles. And I'm not going to render it just yet. I want to set up and clone all of these particles first, and then we'll come back and we can do a test render.